This week, Frank Duff from Tidal Cyber is with us to discuss how threat-informed defense benefits from each security team member. Then Nathan Sportsman from Praetorian joins us to talk about his new hacker history interview project, where the warlocks stay up late. Finally, in the enterprise security news, Veracode acquires Phylum, a free Google Workspace risk assessment tool. It's totally not a trap. U.S. cyber regulations are a hot, disorganized mess. How to say no well. Magic login links suck. A rash of Chrome extension breaches. 2024's worst handled breaches. We'll learn some lessons from those. Security anti-patterns to look for. Content creators shouldn't look at their stats. All that and more on this episode of Enterprise Security Weekly.
This is a Security Weekly production for security professionals by security professionals. Please visit securityweekly.com/subscribe to subscribe to all the shows on our network.
It's the show where we talk security vendors and aren't afraid to name names. It's Enterprise Security Weekly. Do your end users always, and I mean always, without exception, work on company-owned devices and IT-approved apps? I didn't think so. So my next question is, how do you keep your company's data safe when it's sitting on all those unmanaged apps and devices? 1Password has an answer to this question: Extended Access Management. 1Password Extended Access Management helps you secure every sign-in for every app on every device because it solves the problems traditional IAM and MDM can't touch. Check it out at securityweekly.com/1password. Welcome to Enterprise Security Weekly and happy Word Nerd Day. This is episode 389, recorded on Thursday, January 9th, 2025. I'm your host, Adrian Sanabria, and also joining us is the connoisseur of cloud security, our single origin co-host and resident coffee sommelier, Ayman El-Sawa. How are you doing, Ayman?
Hey, Adrian. How are you doing? I'm doing well.
Cheers.
Cheers.
We both have espresso? Yeah.
Yeah, I made an Americano today, mini Americano. So, yeah.
Excellent.
So, I am refreshed after the new year, so yeah.
Same here. It's been a couple of weeks. Nice to get back in the saddle. And so Word Nerd Day is the the one I picked from the list of ridiculous national and international days that they put together to just, so marketing people have something to write about on their blogs, I guess. And I like this one because I am kind of a word nerd, and one of my favorite $10 or $20 words is portmanteau, which is great because it's a word that describes words, specifically words that are a combination of two other words like fantabulous. And I was recently, last year, it's not recent anymore, but last summer I spent a month in Brazil, and I was delighted to find that I don't know if it's Portugal also, but in Portuguese, they love portmanteaus. They use them all the time. They're very funny. They use them like we do. And like Portunhol is one that I learned because I speak a lot more Spanish than I do Portuguese. And that's the word they use for somebody who gets confused and speaks in a mix of Portuguese and Spanish. Any favorite words?
For me, I have on my fridge a new word of the day every day. So I'm a big word nerd.
What's today?
Well, recently it was Cerulean. That was a new word. So
Cerulean?
Cerulean, yeah. Apparently it's a color.
Color blue, yeah.
Yeah, the color blue. So it was fascinating. Yeah.
Yeah, that's a fun one. And Frank, I haven't introduced you yet, but yeah, you might as well get in on this.
Yeah, I'm well known for making up words as I go along. Why be restricted from the English language when you can make your own language? Apparently,
there you go.
Sign of a true word nerd when you make stuff up. Yeah.
Give us a word, Frank. Yeah.
What's that?
So,
never mind. We could cut it.
So today we're talking about how threat-informed defense benefits each security team member, and we're excited to have Frank Duff, the Chief Innovation Officer and co-founder of Tidal Cyber, with us today. Frank has done a wide range of stuff in the public and federal space with his time at MITRE, but most recently and notably, he founded the MITRE ATT&CK evaluations, those tests of EDR tool efficacy you've probably seen floating around. And of course, founding Tidal Cyber with some other fellow folks from MITRE, right?
Absolutely. Yeah. Yeah. It's been quite the journey. I mean, going from almost 20 years at MITRE down to starting up a startup 3 years ago about right now. So it's been a wild ride, but won't change it for the world.
Yeah, yeah, and it's yeah. I always find it very interesting. How much of a shock was that switch going from MITRE to
Yeah.
startup founder? Right, like that had to have been a bit of whiplash.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, you think about MITRE, and a lot of people don't know what all MITRE does, but right, it's a government think tank at the end of the day,
Mhm.
right? And so it's built to go slow, like the government's built to go slow, frankly. And it's a lot of very thoughtful people, risk aversion, trying to do all, and it's the exact opposite in a startup where everything is fast, everything is take risks, calculated risks, but risks, and just focus on execution. So it's been very refreshing to try something new and get out of my comfort zone. So really been enjoying the past few years here.
Yeah, my partner just went from a startup back to Oak Ridge National Labs where she had been
Mm.
previously, and just it's so relaxed.
It
It's
is.
such a
Yeah.
different.
I joke about it all the time. It's like I go through my monthly cycle of like, oh God, like I'm getting super stressed. Man, I wish I was just back at MITRE and could just kind of like
Yeah,
do my 8 to 5 and be good with it.
yeah, yeah. For sure. Yeah. So, I imagine some of your work at MITRE informed founding this company. I think we see that a lot. The labs also. In fact, I was just doing some advisory work for a startup for somebody who's local to East Tennessee. Something that they did at the labs and got permission from the lab to spin it out into a project. Is that kind of what happened here?
Yeah, similar, right? So I done a lot of things at MITRE through my time. The last half of my career was all centered around the MITRE ATT&CK framework. I was doing a lot of detection engineering, actually, back before attack was a thing. And so we started building analytics for what we thought bad guys would do. And then we needed to figure out, okay, well, let's actually figure out what bad guys are doing and build analytics that will actually find them, right? And so we started working with our CTI team, started working with our red team to validate that and what we would call adversary emulation today. And so from that project is what attack came out of, like, because it needed to have this common lexicon to be able to talk across all these
Yeah.
teams, right? And so I started working on that. And then as attack became popular, as one of those things where I could start talking with other vendors about, hey, there's this great framework. Why don't you adopt it? Start working with MITRE customers. Hey, there's this great framework. Why don't you adopt it? We are having a lot of success using it as our communication mechanism. And so it started taking off. And as that kind of spurred on the need for the attack evaluations effort to keep vendors a little bit more honest about what their coverage was and help more than anything. It was less about keeping them honest and more about driving adoption of it.
Mm-hmm.
And propelling the industry forward. But it was like those exact that life cycle through defending, through evangelizing, through figuring out how vendors can use it better that led to me wanting to like go off and start something to actually help the end user figure out like what tools are right for them, what's their risk as it equates to attack, how do they make attack their own. And that's really what Tidal's about. So it's very much founded in that knowledge, those experiences at MITRE, but coming out and trying to figure out how do we actually operationalize something and create a product that people can use to really make attack their own.
Yeah. And how much of a challenge is it to, 'cause there's definitely ways to misuse and to abuse attack. How much of a challenge is that? Like, I imagine the challenge was maybe a little bit different when you were at MITRE than doing what you're doing now because you're building a product, maybe it's easier to guide people in the right direction.
Yeah.
But how much of a challenge has that been
Oh, absolutely. I mean,
yeah.
every time you make a step forward, right, there's 5 steps back of misuse that you have to address, right? Even in something like attack evaluations, right? The concept is sound, right? Build a very repeatable methodology. Don't release scores because then vendors can't say who won. And you know what? Vendors then start claiming who won. And then you start having to figure out how do you actually
we saw a
get
lot of
people
that
to think about
recently.
things. Yeah, exactly. So, and it's so when you're outside of MITRE, which has to play a specific role, right? MITRE can't play favorites and has certain limitations and some of that self-inflicted, but it's also the type of company that MITRE is. But when you're out in doing a startup, right, you can that's what you are trying to do, is you're trying to help define what is right for a given customer. So you have a lot more freedom, but there are a lot of ways of misusing attack, right? Attack bingo is something that loves to get bashed against, rightfully so, right? It's not supposed to be coloring the cells green. But that being said, even a concept like that, right? There is a concept of green. You have to define what green is, right? It can be good enough. It doesn't have to mean you're 100%, right? And I think that the challenge is a lot of people take green to mean 100%. And with procedural variants and things like that, you quickly realize that that's not really the what you should strive for. But instead, it's about being able to be used as a rubric to understand, this is roughly where I'm doing well, this is where I'm not doing well, this is where I can improve. And as long as you kind of treat it with that common sense to it, now it's something that you can actually leverage effectively versus everybody just trying to say, yeah, we have 100% coverage.
Yeah, I mean, a single TTP could be like a 3-year project, right? You know, like some of the items on there are pretty broad.
Absolutely, and some of them probably aren't really worth a whole lot of your time, frankly.
Right.
It all comes down to what threats do you care about? What are those threats using, right? And that's where, like, starting with the threat-informed defense approach, it makes sense, right? It's not just about let's color in the matrix to be compliant. It's about trying to understand what are your greatest threats, then understanding what are you doing to defend against a threat. And now you can actually have a conscious decision about, are you doing good enough?
Right. And, you know, I think that's probably the next thing that makes sense to talk about is where should that come from? You know, where should that guidance come from that tells you, which of these you should care about? I did see, big fan of the guys at Scientia Labs, and they came out with a kind of like a heat map, like a meta-analysis of a bunch of different ransomware reports, and mapped those to the MITRE ATT&CK framework, which, you know, I've been asking for a while. I think Fortinet Labs has done some work there as well. Some of their reports also have this concept of a heat map showing, like, okay, here's what's big for ransomware crews right now. It could change in the future, but right now, like, and is that some of what Tidal is doing? Is trying to guide people, you know, in the right direction to be moving in right now.
Yeah, absolutely, and I love that you plugged the Scientia guys, because we work with Wade on a regular basis, who's over there.
Great. Yeah.
And I've contributed to some of his research, because I do think that
that's right. Of course, I've seen your name on a bunch of the reports.
Accidental plug. So kudos to you, radio host right there. But no, it's one of those things where there's not a lot of data, right? And one of the things that Wade loves to bring up is the bias that exists within the data, which becomes really hard. Not to nerd out on data science and things like that, but like I'm big into understanding where the data comes from. And as you know, like a lot of the CTI, the attack map CTI, is coming from like an EDR vendor. And so they've got a very specific bias on endpoint data versus network data versus dark web data. So they have that unique perspective. So it's like, how do you balance that? And that's why I think efforts like Scientia are really important, because they help try to aggregate all that information and try to reduce the bias to a certain degree. But at the end of the day, right, it's about using whatever threat intel you can, because if you're using threat intel, at least that's a step forward. And the more threat intel you can look at and make sense of, the better that picture becomes. So we tend to think about where to start is try to understand which threats matter to you. And there's a lot of good reporting. There's a lot of good threat intel vendors that will help define which threats matter to you. If you understand generally that, okay, this is what ransomware is doing, that's not all of the 650 techniques in the attack matrix. That's a subset of the attack matrix that is actually being used actively today in intrusions. And so now your 650 is focused down to, let's say, the 200 or 250 techniques. And then you can start looking at, okay, well, what are the impact of those techniques? Which ones are more important than others? Which are choke points? What's the prevalence of those types of things? And that can start allowing you to understand these are actually where the risk lies from an attack matrix standpoint. And that's kind of how we like to think about things.
And I think it's also worth talking about generally where this intel comes from, right? You know, because we're still very much, you know, it's my opinion, in the future we will probably have more transparency into breaches. You know, we're you know, the step we're at right now is starting to require you know, certain companies to report if they pay a ransom or if they have a breach. You know, the SEC's kind of drawn a line in the sand there. And we're actually going to talk about it in the news segment about how it's a total mess of like different states have time requirements for you to report things. And the one thing they stripped out of that was sharing details of how the breach happened. That was in the original version of that SEC rule that they put in that set the 4 days. And in like the 11th hour, they stripped it out, and I was like, "Is that something?"
Yeah, it's like, what's the point then, right?
Yeah.
All you're going to do is get the negative. This person was breached without the benefits of how to stop it from the next time, right? And so that's really disappointing. But yeah, I mean, we utilize a lot of the open source threat intelligence out there, but of course, that's limited to what is made available. And I think that the one challenge is obviously that threat intelligence is very much commoditized, right? And people view it as competitive advantage, right? Take a company like CrowdStrike. They've got absolutely amazing visibility. If you think about the number of assets that they're looking at and having Overwatch or whatever they're calling it these days, that sits over top, like the amount of data that they have is great, but they're selectively picking which to release for whatever reasons they have. And every other vendor is doing that to not pick on CrowdStrike alone, right? But it makes it a little bit challenging, and you're just hoping that they're releasing enough. And if there was actually mandates like you're talking about to release the technical details and make that broadly available, now you start making it so that now there's a more government reason to push this data out, make it commonly available. It's something that so everybody can act on. I know that like the Center for Threat Informed Defense back at my old place, right? They've tried to create projects around attack technique sharing, but it's still restricted to who's actually going to offer it up, and is there enough incentive to offer it up,
what's
or the
incentive,
kindness of their hearts?
Right?
And kindness of the heart, make everybody better, is great in concept, but getting people to actually share is hard.
Does it have to be regulation? Does it have to be regulated for that to happen, do you think?
I don't know how you can do it otherwise, frankly. I mean, this is just me thinking maybe I'm a little bit more pessimistic today than I'd like to be. But again, it's there's too much value in the data if you have the data. Mm-hmm. And as long as there's value in the data and you can make money in the data, there's not incentive to share the data. And so regulation would require the sharing of the data, which would then change that tone.
Yeah, that was my question is how do we fix that problem without regulation? Is there some sort of way to incentivize private companies to share that data? So
you had ISACs might do it, right?
Yeah, maybe exactly. You can depend on the ISACs, and ISACs are great, right? And that is very much like that you'll get the company sharing with the other, like the one that was breached,
right?
Sharing with with their friends under common structure. So those are great, right? Sharing communities are wonderful where they're in place, or trust communities where there's trust communities. But again, that's going to be relatively limited in the amount of data that they have and the visibility, which is the unfortunate thing. There's been efforts, what was it? The Cyber Threat Alliance, I think they called themselves, where like, if you share the data, you can get access to data, that type of relationship.
If you participate.
Yeah, exactly. The more participation and
like
credit
Glassdoor
systems.
the Glassdoor model.
So I mean, there's ways where maybe it's not just strictly compliance or government mandates that are pushing it. And frankly, I think that's one of the one benefits that attack had, right? They're trying to abstract it. They're not trying to get to every procedure, which can be a really hard thing to enumerate if you don't have that data. But the general attack methods that are less variable, at least you can say, here's what the general techniques are, and at least make that a little bit more broadly known. Of course, then it's like, am I detecting the right procedures? Which is, you still need that data at the end of the day.
Yeah. Yeah, one of the things I worry about is, are the things that don't fit into the attack framework, right? Like I spent a lot of time doing postmortems of breaches, analyzing what went wrong. And I do see a lot of value in the people and process side of things, right? Maybe somebody didn't have the training to understand how to use the tool correctly. Or, like one of my favorite examples to use is, with Equifax, the emerging threats team produced a snort rule to detect exploits against the Struts 2 vulnerability, and they handed it off to the ops team and they deployed it. But neither team thought to test it, because we do have a lack of engineering thinking in cybersecurity, that needs to go through some kind of QA step. You need to make sure it works, and then you deploy it to production, right?
That's the thing.
Yeah, so I worry a little bit about that, and that's kind of what I want to. I worry about, like, the day we get to, okay, you have to share data, and it's just data. There's no narrative. There's no context. There's no we deployed the tool correctly, but we didn't configure it correctly, right? So what are your thoughts on how to attack that kind of, well, pardon the pun, but
Yeah,
how to get at those pieces that are kind of in between the lines?
Right, because you need enough, right? You don't need just the data. There's still that benefit that those threat intel providers are providing in terms of just being able to say, this is actually what happened. This is the narrative around it, right? Those breaches. I think, right, seeing like a DVIR type of report around attack techniques, right, to give greater context and to be able to tell, here are the general story and the trends, that could be helpful. I think the other thing is, if the data has enough of the context around it, there's a certain amount of connecting the dots and understanding the in between the lines, or why this was being executed. You can deduce a certain amount of that stuff. So I don't think we're necessarily lost without the context. I think that the bigger problem is not having the data at all. And I'd rather have too much data without the context than right now, where we have limited context and none of the data.
For sure.
So it's a balancing act, and ideally you get both, but I would like to have any of it, frankly, right now.
Yeah. I love it when a security vendor gets hit, because they tend to be very transparent, because that's kind of your only path out of it. Like we saw a vendor, again, we're going to talk about in the news, but had a Chrome extension, and that Chrome extension got popped. And what else are you going to do but be very transparent about what happened and what you're doing about it and stuff like that? But we get these great details out of it. Like, we know that MFA wouldn't have helped, and that the employee that got popped had Google's advanced security enabled. So, like, really good context to understand, the whole workflow of how the phishing worked from the attacker's perspective. Really, really fascinating account on how that happens, and giving up these privileges on managing the extensions, which allowed them to essentially put a backdoor into the extension. Didn't require actually stealing somebody's identity. They just needed you to hit this OAuth approval, and then boom, you're done. And that OAuth approval doesn't require 2FA. So we learned a lot from that because the security vendor got hit.
Yeah, it was the same thing with MITRE. A year or two ago? I think it was last year. They got hit, and
the FTP.
They had to release it. They decided to release all the details around it and use it as an opportunity to share intel, right? And I think that's great. Unfortunately, a lot of the people that get breached don't have the knowledge. The security vendors and the MITREs of the world have at least the situational awareness to understand this is the important parts. These are not the important parts. This is how you to share that information. But yeah.
So let's talk about Tidal a little bit and what you're doing here. I have noticed that you have a community edition here, which is interesting. But yeah, walk me through how you leverage the MITRE ATT&CK framework. How do you kind of create value out of that for the customer? Like, what is the product here?
Absolutely. So the community edition is a great way to get started with Tidal. It's definitely a far reach from the enterprise. The community edition is really focused on trying to give the community back attack-related tooling that can be powerful. Again, myself and the other two co-founders all came from MITRE. We have that same feeling in terms of giving back to the community as much as we can. And so we have that community edition, which allows us to update threat intelligence, drop new threat intel in on a weekly basis. So whereas attack tries to update twice a year, we try to continue to fill the gaps with the things in between. And it's because we have a very different purpose than attack itself, right? Attack is trying to keep that overarching framework and knowledge base. These are the techniques. Whereas we're just like, all right, here's a new threat report. Let's make sure we get that content in there, right? And so we've got that ever-evolving threat landscape. We're adding in additional context. We can be a little bit more lean forward there because we're not, again, MITRE. But then we also layer in, here's what all of these vendors are saying what they can do. We work with the vendors closely to understand that deep level, this is the actual capability that is providing this coverage. It maps to these techniques. And it's interesting, all these vendors that say that they've got the 100% coverage, when they give us the mappings, they're not anywhere near 100%. So, but because we have that relationship, we're working with them to understand what that is. So that's just a knowledge base, right? It's allowing you to explore and just get better use of attacks, search for things, have it be a little bit more timely, free to sign up and use the platform. So I encourage people to do that. What the enterprise platform is really trying to take that to the next level. Allow you to extend attack, integrate with your threat intel, bring in your threat intel, create your own group software campaigns. You could create new techniques and tactics. These are the vendors that you have, right? So CrowdStrike, for instance, only allows us to share with mutual customers, or you can integrate with your custom rule repo in Splunk, pull that in and say that this is how I am mapping to attack, and then be able to do the colliding of the threat against the defenses to say, this is what my relative risk is for each of these given techniques. This is what my attack coverage is. This is what it is for my Windows, my Mac, my Linux, whatever. And then this is what I can do to improve it based off of using your tools more effectively.
Yeah. And that's kind of what gets me excited here. You know, it got me excited about the breach and attack simulation market, which I don't really feel fulfilled its promise, with a few exceptions. There are a few exceptions there. I feel like a lot of them just turned into yet another busy work generator, and we've got too many busy work generators that don't really give companies value. But yeah, like especially like I remember around SolarWinds, so many vendors were like, yeah, we had the capability of finding this. Yeah, sure. Like every product can detect every attack if you crank the meter all the way to maximum noise, right? That's not the problem that we're trying to solve here. Like if a human doesn't see it, it doesn't count.
Right, exactly. And that's one of the things that always got me with, like, when I was doing attack evals and what I've tried to make sure we could represent here is, like, let's say a vendor comes in and says, hey, I've got a special attack rule set that gets me up to that quote unquote 100% coverage, right? Some fancy rule set, they're going to be noisy as all heck, but they've got this long list of rules that map to it. If they've got that capability, let's tell their customers, hey, by the way, there's this rule pack. Use at your own risk. Here's the ramifications. You can get your attack coverage this way. Or because they're too noisy, you don't want to, then accept the risk more or less. And that way the vendor at least says, yeah, well, you could have had that. You've chosen not to for your reasons, which are perfectly fair. But at least now there's some communication to be able to get the vendor who says that they have coverage and the customer who says, well, I'm not configuring it right to get the coverage. They can somewhat get on level playing field. It's about transparency and just enabling that communication. Because I think vendors, for the most part, are really trying to do good. They are trying to secure their customers. The customers want to be secured, but there's just this breakdown in the communication. And so if we can start really enumerating, this is how you are covered today, and this is how you could improve your coverage, that allows customers just to really make good decisions about whether they're accepting the risk or whether they're improving the risk.
Yeah, I remember doing some advisory work for one of the big AV vendors that is no longer one of the big AV vendors. If you know what I mean. This was back in my time when I was an industry analyst. And I remember the engineers, I got on this advisory call. There were like 18 engineers and product people on there. And they were so frustrated. They're like, yeah, our customers aren't turning on all the cool new features, that catch us up with the Cylance and the CrowdStrike, because this was their catch-up release, right? Like they had been passed by the next gen AV vendors. And they're all frustrated customers weren't using it. I was like, okay, walk me through this. And they kind of walk through the configuration console, and all this new stuff is buried like 3-4 levels deep. Like after half an hour looking at this, I was like, guys, like I couldn't, if you paid me, I couldn't configure this thing even close to correctly. Like you've given the customer so much rope to hang themselves with here. You can't expect the customer you're going to have to do some of this for them. Like not everybody's a super power user. They don't understand the temperature slider. They don't. Where do they put that? Like maybe my CEO is going to go to DEF CON and I want to slide that thing all the way up. Like, am I going through there and configuring it week to week, depending on the risk that my employees are like none of this makes any sense for how people actually use their systems and how they need to be protected. So I think there's a huge need to have this translation layer in this conversation going on between buyers and sellers.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think one of the things when we started the company, we weren't really expecting that to be so much the case, right? It's just when we started talking with vendors and being like, hey, we want to, that we just started hearing from both the customers and the vendors complaining about the same thing about each other, right? And it's one of those things where we're like, all right, there seems like there's this opportunity to just kind of be the negotiator in all this, to really try to be that common ground so people can leverage it. But yeah, no, absolutely. I think that there really is the need to just give people transparency. And it goes back to, again, going back to your original comment, it's what came from the original MITRE work that we're doing. Enable transparency, allow people to speak in a common way and understand the things. And I think that the fun thing about doing the startup is you're trying to figure out how to get that to the masses, because you can't just give the Fortune 100 the ability to use ATT&CK. Yeah. It's about how do you actually give that smaller company, that team of one threat intelligence analyst that's also doing hunting as their side gig, how do you give them the power to really understand and utilize ATT&CK to its fullest? And so there's a lot of opportunity there, but transparency is what pushes us forward.
That's awesome. Sure. That's awesome. I love that there's a community aspect and it makes the tool accessible. You know, as a tinkerer, I love hopping in and taking a look at a tool before having to make a major decision, or even booking a sales call. But let me ask you, Frank, what have been some lessons learned in your journey, in this entrepreneurial journey in the past couple of years, even the past year? And what's the future for Tidal?
Yeah, I think my biggest journey, I talk a lot with prospective founders, people that are thinking about doing a startup at this point. Right? I'm just in that right age group where a lot of the people that I've been working with that are a little bit more entrepreneurial are getting that bug, right? And I think that for me, one of the biggest things that I've learned really comes down to the speed of which you can do things. I know that's at least interesting from a security perspective, but just from like a startup perspective, right? You get this big vision from a founders, like you know what you want to do. It's about like getting there fast as possible, but you can only get there so fast. So like that's been the hardest thing I think to adjust to. It's that you want to run, but sometimes you have to walk a little bit. But it's been again an absolute blast and learning how the real world can think or thinks about things, right? There's one of the last things I'll say is like, there were a lot of topics at MITRE that I would have never touched. Risk, hated the word risk, hated the word attack coverage, hated coverage maps and stoplight charts and things like that. Those are all things we do because I believe that we found good ways of doing them. So learning that is necessary because that is actually how enterprises think, the customer thinks, figuring out how to make those happen and how to make sense of them, right? That's been one of the more enjoyable things. It's like changing my whole concept level to figure out, okay, those ideas that people were abusing, there's actually some goodness in there. It shows that they want those things. We just have to actually make them mathematically, scientifically, technologically correct, right? And so that's really where the fun part has been.
Yeah, right on.
And that's probably good marketing content too. You know, like our journey in making traffic lights not suck, right? Or this particular chart type or something like that. Like here's what we discovered we have to do. I love reading that kind of stuff, the discovery as you go along and you build your company, right?
Absolutely. I look forward to sharing that. We do try to write about a fair amount of stuff. Never nearly as much time as we need to write about those things, but I look forward to this because it is fun to look back and think about, man, when I was thinking this and I would have never guessed we are where we are, but here we are. And you know what? It's flourishing and I believe in it and it's the right thing to do and all that.
Yep. All right, Frank, thank you so much for coming on today. It has been a delightful conversation and I'm glad we got to have it today.
Absolutely. Thanks for having me and appreciate getting the chance to talk with you both.
Pleasure.
All right. Stay tuned. When we come back, we're going to talk about building an oral history of cybersecurity and hacking with Nathan Sportsman from Praetorian.